Hi, my name is Jervan Rampersad, and welcome to my presentation entitled Language Acquisition in Deaf Children, a Comprehensive Scope. So let's begin in terms of thinking about deafness. What do we understand by deafness? So what does it mean to be deaf? Deafness refers to the incapability to hear, and it can stem from both congenital and acquired causes. Congenital meaning from birth, acquired meaning later on in life. So, for instance, damage to your ear or that entire auditory apparatus. Hearing in general is a pivotal part, actually, of human communication by means of conventional language. So that directly refers to spoken language. Sign language then was convened as resulting from the lack thereof of hearing, but as an equivalent means of human language and communication. So then, understanding deafness to a basic phase, let's look at the focal points of this presentation. So we'd first be looking at 1. Language acquisition in deaf children with deaf parents. 2. Language acquisition in deaf children with hearing parents. And lastly, 3. The discrepancies between language acquisition of the deaf and hearing children. So let's begin with our first focal point, language acquisition in deaf children with deaf parents. So we're going to look into the process. So nonverbal gestures are equally as innate as verbal gestures in infantile language acquisition. So for instance, you'd actually see kids from a certain age, let's just say roughly 6 to 7 months or 4 to 5 months, actually reaching out for things. If they want someone to hold them, a specific person, they want their mom, they're going to reach out to their mom. That is in itself nonverbal gestures. Through that relay communication, they relay the message that, yeah, they want to go by their mom or they want this object. So nonverbal gestures are the first innate development in communication that starts the way or paves the way for language. So this points to linguists denoting that sign languages are naturally evolved linguistic systems similar to that of conventional spoken communication. Linguistic context in this situation particularly already implies that the parents, being deaf, would be already skilled and competent users of sign language. So to understand this stage, we need to understand the concept of manual babbling, which is a fundamental coinage indicative of the development of sign languages in deaf children with deaf parents. So let's begin with manual babbling as stage 1 in this process. So it is basically heavily reliant on exposure to caretakers competent in sign language or already competent, and it usually begins from 6 to 7 months onwards according to Lapiak. So to the right, you can observe some of the phonemes or some of the gestures that the child begins to make in terms of recognizing phonemes and beginning to articulate them. So these are some of the signs that you would actually see in the manual babbling stage, which is an attempt of realizing and articulating phonemes. So to the left, you would see a child exposed to a competent sign language counterpart, and she's actually beginning to attempt the sign for banana, for the B in banana, and her counterpart actually recognizes so and continues the actual sign. So stage 2 is basically syllabic manual babbling, and it is a direct continuation of manual babbling, but it is sort of a development in the sense that it officially marks the recognition of phonemes. So kids are not only recognizing certain phonemes, but they start in an active process of trying to articulate these by means of usually reduplication. And according to Lapiak again, this usually happens between the 8 to 9 month phase in children that are learning sign language, and then onwards. So if you look to the right, you would actually see some of the gestures or the signs which mark the attempt at articulation for phonemes at this stage. You have for A, for B, for C, and for D, the different articulations that you may see. So for instance, the left image could actually refer to the reduplication concept that I was explaining above. So this is based on the needs analysis or the needs basis of the child. So take for instance, mom or milk. These are things that a child may need or will need on a regular basis. So take for instance, reduplication of this situation would call for a duplication of that phoneme, and then it may even influence the first word beginning with M. So for instance, the child's first word might be mom or milk. So in the image, the child is actually looking at a picture with her mom holding her, and she instinctively tries to sign for mom. Stage 3, first word utterances. So this is heavily influenced by the reduplication and canonical babbling that can take place from us, and this stage could usually take place from as early as 8 months to as late as a year and 4 months. So, as according to Lapiak. So, in the first word utterances, as in syllabic manual babbling, I was explaining the reduplication in terms of the needs of the child. It is the same process. So, basically, mom could develop as a first word for the child, or even milk, because of the fact that the child has to reduplicate it on an often basis, seeing as they would need these things. So take for instance, in this stage, reduplication usually happens in terms of fluency. So to the left, it actually shows a woman signing the sign for bear, and to the right, it actually shows a child age 11 months becoming almost fluent in the sign for bear. But it is basically understood that he is trying to sign bear. So it says something about the fluency of the child, that it is almost in a nearly developed stage. The fourth stage, multi-word utterances. So at this stage, the child is basically capable of developing their own lexicon and increasing their utterances as they begin to develop on their articulatory senses and more signs begin to emerge. So at this stage, syntactic correlations and the emergence of sentences also begin to appear. And according to Lapiak, it begins from at least in that 1 year to 2 year gap of a deaf child. So here we have a compilation according to the conventions of Lapiak from Handspeak, with the 4 stages of leading from manual babbling to multi-word utterances in the development of in the process of language acquisition in deaf children with deaf parents. So it is there for your perusal. So language acquisition in deaf children with hearing parents. Now let's look into that process. Communication is still possible between both parties, even with the absence of either side being competent in a sign language. The discrepancy between this linguistic context and a situation which comprises of a language competent caregivers, of sign language competent caregivers, are as follows. So manual babbling is heavily based on gestures due to the lack of common linguistic ground or exposure to a linguistic system that acts as a guide to communication. Gestures in this context of children are pivotal to their nonverbal development, and they have the potential to heavily shape a system of expression in the child's language. So gestures lends itself to basically how a language develops. So in this case, due to the absence of an exposed linguistic system, the child then creates his or her own gesture-based system that facilitates effective communication between him or her and the parent. This is evident through syntactic structure that the child develops, where object typically precedes the verb and subject in word order. So here we can actually see an example of this type of communication. So the left is indicative of the object-first system that deaf children may have when they are not exposed to sign language competent parents. So they would typically point to the object first, sign to the object, and then sign for the task that they want done. So in this case, a child would want the jar open. So he signs first, object first, then open. The right is indicative of a child that is exposed to parents competent in sign language. So the child would first give the sign for you, then the verb to open, and then sign to the jar. So language acquisition between deaf and hearing children. What's the difference between them? So primarily both sign language as well as conventional language are considered, conventional meaning spoken, are considered linguistic systems in their own right. Therefore, language acquisition given the right exposure means there is no difference between language acquisition period in both contexts. So this could actually be justified via observation of similarities between linguistic researchers. So take for instance, first Sanders points out in the case of spoken language that children approximately acquire and master all phonemes by the age of 8 years as a preamble to competent communication. In the case of sign languages, similarities could also be seen in these linguistic views. So Lapiak added that the acquisition of spoken English phonemes by 7 to 8 years is actually no different from a child acquiring all ASL primes within a similar age range. Petito and Marantet also argue that the acquisition milestones between deaf children and hearing infants are similar in many ways, acknowledging reduplication as a key characteristic in either polar spectrum that catalyzes the mastering of phonemes. So we know that reduplication happens in deaf children in their language acquisition, but it also happens in the language acquisition of hearing children. So it is a common thread in terms of language acquisition in general. Discrepancies between hearing and deaf children may vary based on sociolinguistic factors such as the status of sign language in certain territories. So take for instance the media house, the Trinidad Guardian, has highlighted a clear language gap between the deaf and hearing in the linguistic context of Trinidad and Tobago. So this then limits the linguistic situations that a deaf child would be exposed to as compared to speaking children, of course, especially in the context of exposure and availability of competent speakers, which is fundamental to language acquisition development and the development of children by means of language socialization. So basically exposure to competent language users impacts the development of that child. So we could also then say that the real discrepancy, the only real discrepancy, is in a sociolinguistic perspective of the environment that that child is in. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and do remember that there is no difference between sign language and conventional spoken language in terms of them being linguistic systems in their own right. They are both linguistic systems and languages in their own right. And as the GIF implies, we don't think of ourselves as being impaired. We can do a lot of things. The only thing we can't do is hear. So this is my work cited for your perusal. Thank you so much again for your time. Do have a good day.